and welcome again. The last talk closed with a big serve on the culpability of order followers, specifically the police. It's time now to focus on those who give them their orders, the politicians and legislators, which also includes the judiciary. The police are, after all, mere automatons who either never developed a conscience allowing them to differentiate right from wrong, or if they did, have voluntarily surrendered it to the whims of others in return for pay. It may be expected that if these pitiful specimens were at some stage to be given orders which uphold natural law and justice, a reasonable number of them would comply with the new policies, underlining their basic nature as comparable with domestic canines. However, we're fortunate that one of the movers and shakers of the unlawful coterie impersonating legitimate government in Australia recently poked her head over the parapets and decided to gaslight the few people in this country who understand and support the efficacy and validity of Magna Carta 1215. That was done publicly, unfortunately, constitutes sedition, which is the public undermining of the Constitution of the Commonwealth. By Commonwealth, I refer, of course, to the Commonwealth of Great Britain, of which Australia, despite the protestations, deceptions and machinations of many successive administrations, remains a part. Professor Anne Twomey, the author, will be placed on notice with evidence of this breach of constitutional law, which will afford her the opportunity of correcting this infringement. Professor Anne Twomey, BA, LLB, Honours from Melbourne, LLM from ANU, PhD from the University of New South Wales, Professor Emerita, Constitutional Law, Sydney University, is obviously an extremely well-qualified academic who has occasionally acted as consultant to various government bodies. On or about the 28th of July, Professor Twomey posted a video purporting to give an accurate description of the relevance of Magna Carta to today's society, particularly in Australia, in relation to the legal system we have currently operating here. There are a number of errors of fact, but the main thrust of this talk is to illustrate that her entire presentation is based upon certain false premises or presumptions, and it's on these that I will finish. A few factual errors, however, do need rebutting. They are too significant to be allowed to stand. First, Professor Twomey describes the barons responsible for the existence of Magna Carta 1215 as rebellious. This is inaccurate. The barons were, in fact, as part of the administration of the country, simply doing their duty in upholding the law and bringing King John to account for his crimes, which consisted of numerous breaches of his coronation oath, in which he, along with every monarch of which we have record from the time of Henry II, swears to protect the rights and liberties of not only the Church, but also of every crown subject, quote, according to the laws and customs of the people, unquote. Many people don't realise that the monarch is themselves a subject of the crown, which is an abstract representation of the lawful authority in England, and may be classified as a Grundnorm defined by Hans Kelman as the ultimate lawful authority in any community based upon norms of behaviour that are accepted by that entire community. Professor Twomey diligently declines to go anywhere near this topic and will return to it later. Secondly, Twomey states that Magna Carta was signed by John at Runnymede, but the document was sealed, not signed. Why is this distinction important? The monarch's seal is a seal of office, meaning that its obligations extend to everyone who may bear that office in perpetuity. It is not the result of legislation, but custom, and thus bears a significantly greater weight than a signature of a monarch. Third, there's the claim that the Pope annulled the Charter. This is a furphy. While the Pope may have exercised ecclesiastical dominion over King John, Pope Innocent III had no secular jurisdiction over England to interfere in any way with the internal workings of English justice, For John to even have appealed to the Pope to do so was a yet further instance of his treason. More to the point, the Pope had no army with which he could enforce any such edicts upon Crown subjects. And as we progress further into Professor Twomey's video, the concept of being able to enforce so-called laws by force becomes ever more prominent in her somewhat supercilious celebration of how the law works in Australia. Her attitude is characterised by the posture of, this is how we do it in Australia, and like it or not, that's it. Whether or not there is any question of morality or natural justice involved is completely beside the point. For her and those she supports, it's a fait accompli which the common people are expected to accept without protest. The ones with the letters after their names are the only ones whose opinions are worth considering, which reeks of moral relativism, with some people having more rights than others, including the right to devise legislation, which Twomey persistently incorrectly defines as laws, to suit their own purposes. However, in the experience of this author, the more letters people have after their names, the more likely that the contents of their skulls resembles alphabet soup. They have often spent much time in ivory towers and have little point of contact with those whose deliberations and pronouncements they adversely affect. Other inaccuracies have been addressed by Will Keat in the comments of the video itself. I include a section of quotes from him here. Quote, "Juries existed in late Saxon times. Indeed, King Alfred hanged 2 judges for going against the decision of the jury." Here's a quote that Will has. "Yet the English were very zealous for them of the laws of Edward the Confessor, common law, no less or otherwise than they are at this time for the Great Charter, insomuch that they were never satisfied till the said laws were reinforced and mingled for the most part with the coronation oath of King William I and some of his successors." End quote, from Hale's History of Common Law, page 157. It's also worth pointing out that Magna Carta 1215 was not legislation, statute. The whole point of it was that it was beyond the reach of Parliament and was binding on the King in perpetuity. Magna Carta 1215 was a re-expression of the constitutional principles of England. Furthermore, the whole point of the Constitution is to limit the power of government. That includes the legislature. You cannot have any part of government, any of the branches, or even the King at the time who was the government, writing themselves out of that arrangement of limitation. That would be absurd. Spokespeople will always deny the inevitability of natural rights, but it's illogical to do so. As Lysander Spooner made quite clear in his essay of 1852, the only legitimate constitution that can exist is one that simply recognises and upholds the already existing natural rights of the people, such as Magna Carta 1215. It's not government's job or their moral right to limit people's rights. Only the consciences of a jury can judge a man. Anything else destroys the principle of equity, that we're all equal under the law. That was from page 32 of Crabb's A History of English Law, or an attempt to trace the rise, progress and successive changes of the common law from the earliest period to the present time. It cannot be denied that the practice of submitting causes to the decision of 12 men was universal among all the northern tribes of Europe from the very remotest antiquity." End quote. Will continues, "She's wrong on much of what she is saying. The problem with this is that the entire establishment of both the UK and Australia and elsewhere is swimming with collectivist notions. Our entire mindset that is held largely by the political class is to reject the very notion or idea that the government is limited in its power. Then surely the natural question that would arise is, can the government legitimately do anything it likes? If the answer to that is yes, then why all the pretense about the 800th anniversary of the Great Charter? Our establishment over here, Anne, thinks a lot of it. What is this rule of law you talk about? Surely, if there are no limitations other than what the government itself pretends are limitations, then we're all in big trouble, aren't we? Because ultimately, a government could legitimately legislate on who lives or who dies. A bit extreme, I realise, but the point still stands. If the answer is no, then you would be admitting to some kind of limitation placed upon government, which would mean that there is also a limitation placed on the legislature too. You can't have government which was created by man writing itself into constitutional authority. It doesn't make sense logically. Will continues, I will indeed have a look at the book suggested, but I suspect that, as I have said, it fails to answer the key question that Spooner put. Who is the final arbiter of law? Where does the government ultimately gain its authority or consent, if not from the supremacy of the jury? Please don't give voting as the answer to that question. A tribunal of the people was a tradition that existed all over Europe, and even Emperor Conrad of Germany, the Pope at the time, 200 years prior to the 1215 Magna Carta, said almost exactly the same thing as Article 39. In Latin, nemo beneficium suum perdat, nisi secundum consuetudinem antecessorum, nostrorum et per judicium parium suorum. It means no one shall lose his estate unless according to the custom of our ancestors and the judgment of his peers. But you notice the use of the word et judicium parium suorum, and the judgment of his peers. No confusing Latin word vel in this instance. And that is from Blackstone, quoting this in his third commentaries on the laws of England. And the language of Article 39 is about judgment, Anne. Article 20 also talks about the peers judging. From Gilbert's introduction to the history of the common pleas of page 19, no cause of consequence was determined without the king's writ. For even in the county courts of the debts which were above 40 shillings, there issued a justice's commission to the sheriff to enable him to hold such a plea, where the suitors, jurors, are judges of the law and fact. It is agreed by all our historians that the Great Charter of King John was, for the most part, compiled from the ancient customs of the realm or the laws of Edward the Confessor, by which they mean the old common law, which was established under our Saxon princes. That's from Blackstone's introduction to the Great Charter, Blackstone's Law Tracts, page 289. Thank you, Will, for those quotes. Unlike Magna Carta 1215, which bound the monarchy in perpetuity to uphold their coronation oath, and the common law, which binds each crown subject to respect and uphold natural law, contrived legal contraptions like the 1901 Australian Constitution exert no moral obligations upon those born decades after its deceptive introduction. That is doubly true since the invocation of Article 61, which rendered all such attempts at diminishing or limiting the liberties protected under Magna Carta null and void. For commentators such as Professor Twomey, the metaphorical challenge is that of the gauntlet laid across the cheeks. Show us a non-circular argument as to the assumed stature of your claimed authority. If it is simply the result of wealthy or well-connected individuals chumming together to assert dominance backed by armed force, then passing that dominance down to selected relatives or chums, that is not lawful. It is in fact criminal behaviour, and it does not become legitimate or lawful simply because the perpetrators have been getting away with it for a long time, Professor Twomey. I'm happy to debate this principle with you at any convenient time. That authority cannot derive from popular vote or plebiscite, for whence comes the authority of any individual to surrender their sovereignty to another, then directing that other to use that false authority to coerce other third parties? The concept is absurd. There can be no such authority in natural law. which means that it is merely a mental construct of some men designed to enslave others. There can be no moral obligation to comply with such claims. Indeed, there can exist only the moral obligation to resist and ultimately replace such iniquitous dominance with lawful justice. Until it is replaced with natural constitutional law, we're driven unavoidably to the conclusion that, far from the claims of Professor Twomey of benevolent legitimacy, government in its current form exists merely as a sophisticated manifestation of organised crime. Thank you for watching.